and welcome. My name is Brian Yao.
And my name is Lawrence Tan.
And today, we'll be talking about the cat and mouse game between video game hackers and video game developers. We'll talk about the history of video game hacks and why they're used, as well as the measures that video game companies took to prevent these cheats from getting out of control, and how those measures quickly became outdated. From there, we'll look at what is currently used by the biggest names in the video game industry, as well as the potential security issues that come with having such powerful anti-cheat software. Finally, we will talk about what's next for the future of video game hackers and the software developers bent on keeping competitive video games exploit-free. Video game hacking ranges from a variety of exploits, with some being harmless mods that make the game more enjoyable. For instance, a popular video game called Minecraft has whole communities and even businesses centered around modding the game. In this case, these modifications are more than welcome by Mojang, Minecraft's parent company, and they even provide tools for getting players started. Some games, such as Defense of the Ancients or Dota, even originated from being a mod in another game. In general, these types of hacks are more than welcome by developers and breathe life into the video game industry, often creating spin-offs that end up developing into its own video game ecosystem. On the other end of the spectrum, there exist malicious hacks that serve to give players a competitive advantage in video games. These are what most people think of when video game hacks are mentioned. These hacks could include aimbots in first-person shooters, or scripts that play the game to pixel-perfect perfection. These types of hacks are generally frowned upon, and video game developers are constantly developing software in an attempt to detect and ban anyone who uses these types of hacks. These hacks and the software used to try to detect them are going to be the focus of this presentation. In the modern day, the video game industry is doing everything in its power to prevent video game hacks from happening. However, game developers weren't always this devoted to putting an end to hacks in their games. Rather, they would oftentimes intentionally or unintentionally leave small exploits that could lead to an entirely different gameplay experience if discovered. These exploits would usually be added to make development easier, as jumping to different parts of the game was not easy when computers were still as slow as they were back in the day. However, they'd occasionally be left there, even after release, resulting in the so-called cheat codes that everyone was trying to crack. However, it wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that video games went online and had gone to a place where anti-cheat software was necessary. One of the first instances of anti-cheat software came in 2000 with Punkbusters and Valve Anti-Cheat. The way these systems worked was by storing a database of software that they knew were known for hacking games. Then, upon installing and playing video games with these anti-cheat softwares, the anti-cheat software would scan through your computer's memory to check if any memory matches up with the software they stored in their database. If it did, then your PC would receive an immediate ban from games like Battlefield, Rainbow Six, and Call of Duty, where having these hacks would provide an unfair competitive advantage. Hacker groups quickly retaliated. In Punkbusters' case, a group called Netcoders exploited the fact that Punkbusters simply scans all of the virtual memory for instances of any anti-cheat program. To take advantage of this, Netcoders would send text fragments of known cheats onto a high-traffic IRC channel. As a result, anyone who was on those IRC channels would have those cheat fragments on their computer and therefore be considered a cheat by Punkbuster. Needless to say, early anti-cheat software, although well-intentioned, could cause more problems than it solved, with false positives. As hackers got more advanced, these anti-cheat softwares could only do so much before they were discontinued for a better type of anti-cheat software. That's where kernel-level anti-cheat software comes into play. Kernel-level anti-cheat software works by installing a driver on the kernel level of whatever device is being used, as opposed to previous anti-cheat softwares that were only on the user level. The kernel is the highest privilege level that the software can have on the device and has a view of everything happening on the computer, even programs running outside of the game. On the other hand, user-level software is at the lowest privilege level and has very few permissions. As a result, these kernel-level anti-cheat softwares are considerably more powerful and better at detecting video game cheating. This diagram better illustrates how this works. Any user-level cheat that the gamer tries to implement will be immediately caught by the kernel anti-cheat system. To reiterate, this is only possible because the anti-cheat software was given such high authority by being installed in the kernel. Despite being so effective at catching user mode cheats, hackers have still found ways to bypass even these kernel-level anti-cheat drivers. How? By writing their own kernel-level cheating software. As shown in this diagram, by having their own cheat driver in the kernel level, hackers are able to bypass the anti-cheat detection and continue to get unfair advantages in video games. From a high level, the process to develop these kernel-level cheats involves 5 steps. The first step is reversing, where the adversary finds the offsets at which the important data and fields are located in memory relative to the game address. The next step is hooking, which is the process of finding a system call function and hooking shellcode for establishing communication between the user and the kernel onto said function. Thirdly, the adversary must create a driver that will read and write video game memory. Next, they have to load the driver. Finally, a user mode program must be written to enable the adversary to communicate and issue commands to the newly installed kernel-level cheat driver. Although this method of creating kernel-level cheat drivers is possible, it's considerably harder than before, when cheats were only in user mode. Paul Chamberlain, the anti-cheat lead of Riot Games, said that for cheat developers operating at the kernel level, they need to work around the restrictions Microsoft places on kernel-level software. This extra work reduces the incentives for cheat developers because their cheats become harder to make, less convenient for players to install, and just overall less profitable to sell.
While game makers appreciate kernel mode drivers for the level of access to the system that they provide, it is exactly this level of access that causes gamers to be wary of these drivers. The first uses of kernel mode drivers in gaming were for anti-piracy, such as the infamous StarForce system from the early 2000s. StarForce worked to prevent pirated copies of the game disc from running by using a driver to monitor data being loaded from the optical disk drive. This driver was installed silently without the user's interaction, and became notorious for interfering with the computer's ability to play audio CDs from the disk drive, as well as causing Windows to crash and even preventing the OS from booting at all. Because the driver was very difficult to uninstall completely, users were often forced to delete their entire OS and reinstall Windows from scratch. Unhappy users began lawsuits against game publishers like Ubisoft and Sony that used StarForce and other similarly buggy kernel mode drivers, leading them to gradually discontinue the use of kernel mode drivers for anti-piracy. Modern implementations of kernel mode drivers, such as Riot Games Vanguard and Denuvo Anti-Cheat, are used to combat the increasing amount of cheating in online multiplayer games. While they appear to have avoided the system-destroying bugs of the early kernel mode drivers, controversy around their usage has continued to this day. Because these drivers run at the highest privilege level, they are able to access programs and files, monitor user activity like usernames and passwords typed, and otherwise compromise the security of the computer. Even if users trust the game companies to not spy on them, the mere presence of the kernel driver increases the attack surface of the computer, because it is always possible that outsiders could discover vulnerabilities in the drivers that allow them to gain access to the kernel. Kernel drivers can also use their privileges to silently update themselves without user interaction, which means that game companies, or potentially even adversaries, could change the functionality of the driver without the user's consent. These factors have led to considerable backlash from the PC gaming community. For example, when Bethesda added de novo kernel mode anti-cheat to Doom Eternal in a 2020 post-release game update, they received heavy backlash from gamers who were upset that they would be forced to install a new kernel driver or be locked out of playing a game that they had already bought. Bethesda soon publicly apologized and promised to remove the anti-cheat entirely in the next game update. Even with kernel mode anti-cheat, game developers will always find themselves in a cat and mouse game against cheaters, especially those who sell cheats to other users for profit. A presentation at the 2022 Game Developer Conference outlined a potential way to address this problem in the future without resorting to ever more powerful and invasive anti-cheat software. The presentation makes the assertion that instead of punishing all players with a zero-tolerance anti-cheat system, developers should address the motivations of different groups of cheaters. While the small group of people who are building and selling cheating tools for profit need to be handled with the strongest tactics like kernel mode drivers and legal threats, players with less illicit motivations may be reformed using other methods. For example, players who cheat to gain an upper hand in the game, or simply to unlock in-game collectibles faster, may be more easily reformed by increasing lengths of account suspensions or penalties, since they ultimately want to protect access to play their favorite game. In the early days, video game cheats were limited to simple mods and codes. With the rise of online multiplayer, however, the arms race between cheaters and game developers began, with the first user mode anti-cheat systems like Punkbuster, then advanced to kernel-level anti-cheat, like Valorant's Vanguard. While cheaters can still get around kernel-level drivers by implementing their own kernel-level hacks, game developers still value kernel drivers as they make hacking more difficult and limited. The continued community backlash against kernel-level drivers for the ability to accidentally break the user's system and for the increased attack surface they present, however, means that increasing the invasiveness of anti-cheat systems may not be a sustainable long-term solution to the cheating problem. In the future, developers could implement more community-based reforms to keep their games enjoyable to all players. In the meantime, however, dropping into a quick game of Valorant or Fortnite will require trusting the game with full control of your computer, a shaky prospect for computer security.